going to read it one more time because you need to know this. This is important for today. A captive bird that is so fixated on an unchanging environment that any change that takes place in this bird life stimulates one of two things, either aggression or fearfulness. Now, when you look at these birds are experiencing cage bound. Now, the owner of these birds has already opened the door to the cage, meaning that these birds are actually free. But when you look at the picture, although the birds are free, what in the world are they doing staying in the cage? Now, the owner opens the cage and gives the birds free range to go about and fly and do whatever they need to do. But these birds have made a conscious decision that we will stay in this cage. Thus, they get the title cage bound, meaning the cage is open for you to fly, but you don't fly. You're comfortable staying confined to the cage. Now listen, two of the most common things that take place with a cage-bound bird is, one, the bird becomes cage-bound because the bird has had a lot of contact with human beings that didn't treat it good. So the bird has had contact with too many people that didn't have the bird's best interest at hand, so it forces the bird to become cage bound. That's number one. Number two is the bird has been shut up in the cage so long that the bird becomes comfortable in its confinement. Meaning the bird has been locked up so long that the bird reaches a point in its life where the bird feels safer in a cage than exploring the uncertainty of what's outside of it. So the bird is so comfortable in a cage that even when freedom is at the door, because I don't really know what I'm dealing with outside of the cage, and because of what I dealt with in my past with humans, and because I've been locked up so long that I don't even know what the future holds, the bird will stay in the cage. This is where we get cage bound from. Now, this is what happens. When the bird stays in the cage, the bird begins to develop this aggression. And what happens is, when the owner comes in to stick his hand in the cage to feed the bird or to give water to the bird will act out aggressively at times and attack the owner. So the bird, when you meet an owner of them, what you'll realize is a lot of times the owner arms will have scratches, claw marks, and it'll be bruises on the arm because every time the owner tries to take care of the bird lunges out at the owner out of aggression because the bird is cage bound. Now listen, when you're dealing with a cage bound bird, that cage door can be open for months, for years, and that bird will never come out. But this is what happens. Watch this. What happens is, once the owner lifts the cage, the owner has done his job. Now the owner steps back, and the owner makes sure that the environment around the bird is safe. So when he opens up the cage door, the owner or her, they go and they begin to clean up around where the bird can possibly come out and fly because they want to make sure the bird is in a safe environment. But after that, the owner actually steps back and the owner is done. Now the owner steps back and the owner just waits on this bird or birds to come out of the cage. But this is what's amazing. When I was studying on it, it says now with a cage-bound bird, the owner cannot let the bird break out of the cage on its own. But the owner has to be the one to open the door for the bird. But listen what it said. It says, but the owner will not force the bird out of the cage, but the owner will sit back and wait for the bird to take its first step out of confinement. So the owner don't care how long it takes his birds to come out of this cage. He's going to sit back, make sure the atmosphere is ready, and he's going to wait. Now this is what it says. At times, the birds will bite, they will scream, and they will act out with unwanted behavior. But it says the owner cannot respond to the birds the same way the birds are responding to the owner. So the birds will act out, but this is what the owner does. So the owner does this. The owner say, I can't focus on the screaming and the biting that's taking place to me as the owner, simply because if I focus on that, I can never address the underlying situation. So the owner said, what I must do as the owner is find out what caused those birds to become cage bound in the first place. And I can't help them if I first don't find out what caused them to be in that predicament to begin with. Now, when you're dealing with the cage-bound bird, this is what it tells us that we have to do. Now, the cage-bound bird behavior is vitally important to the owner because the bird needs interaction and stimulation, right? Now, a bird naturally hangs out in a flock. You know that, right? Birds hang out in groups. So the bird desires that togetherness of a group because it stimulates the bird. But this is what they said. The owner cannot interact or stimulate the bird sitting next to the cage watching TV. This is what they said, not me. It said the owner cannot stimulate the bird or interact with the bird watching TV. It said, but the bird needs the owner's undivided attention just like the owner needs the bird's undivided attention. So the owner cannot have the TV and a lot of sounds on, but what the owner does is he cuts everything off and the owner sits back. And the owner spends one-on-one time with the bird. And the owner lowers his voice, and the owner stoops down to the level of the bird, and the owner begins to speak to the bird in a calming voice to comfort the bird in hopes that eventually the bird will become everything that the bird was supposed to be to begin with before the bird became cage bound. Now, do me a favor and turn to your neighbor and tell your neighbor, I'm coming out. Now, I'm going to say this the second time. If you don't believe you coming out and you want to stay confined to your cage, then you don't need to say this. But this is only for people who really want to come out of their cage and experience everything that God has designed for them. So if I really don't want it, then don't speak it, because when you speak things into the atmosphere, things begin to change. So if you don't want it, then you don't say this. So everybody ain't got to say it the second time. Only those people that really want it, look at your neighbor and tell your neighbor, I'm coming out. Now when God showed me this, it really opened my eyes and it showed me myself, and it allowed me just to examine areas and everything. But this is what God said. He said, it's a lot of my children who can see freedom, but they have yet to truly experience it. They're in a cage where they can look out and see far beyond the bars of the cage. But even though freedom is right there, the bird can see it just like we can. But for whatever reason, we see it, we see others operate in it, but yet we have never experienced what true freedom really is. Now listen, this is a trick of the enemy, and this is what he'll do. The enemy will cause us to become fixated on certain moments of our life. Watch this. So when I become fixated on certain moments of my life, I become confined by that moment.